version of the Form W-9. They have not released it yet. Now, the draft version was issued on July 26, 2023. And the good news is that they would not change that draft version unless they issued yet another draft version, which they have not done. Now, don't fret about waiting for the IRS to publish it or to release the October 2023 version, because I looked it up when they released the version that we have right now, which is the October 2018 version. They released it October 29th. And so of 2018. And so it's mid-October, again, as of the recording of this podcast. So it's not like it's out of the ordinary to not have it published or the new version published already. So in the interim, let's talk about a substitute W-9 and some recommendations on what to include. Now, before we get started, I do want to say, and I'll have a link in the show notes, that the IRS, if you didn't know, does allow for substitute W-9. And I'll put a link to the instructions for the requesters of the W-9, because that does show where a link or where a W-9, substitute W-9 is allowed, and it also identifies what you need to include on one. Now, keep in mind that when the IRS publishes the latest version, right, finally publishes the October 2023 version of the W-9, they should also release, although it could be a few days later, the updated instructions for the requesters of the W-9. That is where you find what is required to include on the sub W-9. But for the most part, it is really the information that they collect, including the certifications. The information that's required. So make sure you check that out. I will put a link to the existing version. Actually, yeah, I'll put a link to the existing version and you can check it out now if you like. And then maybe you can get started. Now, if you already have a substitute W-9, you might want to just take a look at the current or the new version, the revision October 2023, just to see what you might want to, just to see what you are going to have to update. And I'm also going to put a link, and I think I did the last podcast too, where I talked about the training session that I have for the IRS Form W-9, and it's typically the third Wednesday of every month, and I always talk about it from, or train from, the perspective of the vendor team member, right? What to look for when accepting it from your vendor, and I have examples by tax classification, and so all of October, I switched it to, or I added more training sessions, weekly training sessions, and I go over the October 2023 updates and what to expect. And then once the IRS updates or releases the final version, I will go ahead and update the examples. But if you're interested in taking that training session, I will put a link to that in the show notes as well. And I think I had a link to it, like I said before, in prior podcast episodes for October, but you'll find one in the show notes here. All right, so now that we know we can have one, a substitute W-9, let's talk about the benefits of it. And the benefits are at least two, and maybe you can think of other benefits based on your company, industry, or process. So the biggest benefit that I see with using a substitute W-9 over the IRS's version of the W-9 is you get to collect more information. So on the IRS's version of the W-9, you get the legal name, you might get the DBA if they have one, you get one address, and then you get the tax ID, and that's it. But how often do we need more information, right? Maybe you want to collect their DUNS number. Maybe you want to collect additional addresses, especially if the address on the W-9 is a P.O. box. You always want to collect a physical address just to be sure that it's not a fraudster, trying to get set up, because lots of times they'll hide behind P.O. boxes. And so you want to, avoid fraud. So it's fine that they give you a P.O. box, but they also must follow that up with a physical address as well. And you can collect that on your substitute W-9. Now, you can also collect things like diversity classification. So you can identify the ones that are important to your company and then just have them check the applicable box that is applicable for them. I also include on the substitute W-9 form that I use for my clients the quote unquote entity classification. And I don't know if that's, would be the right verbiage for you, but what this field or section is supposed to identify is if you have, for an example, a C corporation, so they've selected entity type as a C corporation, which means that they are not reportable except or unless they have payments that have to be reported, even if their tax class says they're not reportable. And these are things like legal services, medical services, right? There's a whole list of that, which again, I go over in that IRS W-9 training session I talked about earlier. But this way you can have the vendor self-identify by selecting those fields through an applicable checkbox if it applies to them. And you can make it be anything, but the way I have 4 of them set up, I have legal/attorney services, medical services, other government, and then other specify, and I have a field where they can key it in. So this is one way that the vendor can tell you, and sometimes that's really good for the vendor team because we don't always have the direct relationship with the vendor. We don't really know what they're buying, especially if it's not a PO vendor. And so this can help us out at the time of vendor setup. Another thing that I collect is the contact information. So the contact name, phone number, fax number, if you're still using fax, and then also their email address. So that is really good to collect. And then the last thing that I collect, and this is especially true for new vendors, actually is great for existing vendors too, is I collect the contact information from the internal employee that they have a relationship with. And this can be the buyer if it's a PO vendor, or it could be, right, whoever they are dealing with if it's not a PO vendor, which can come in very handy, right? Because if there's anything suspicious about the email or the request, especially if it's a request to change vendor banking, right? If you suspect fraud, now you have someone that you can reach out to. In addition to that, it's one of those fields that if a fraudster got this far and is trying to get set up in your accounting system, right, that fake vendor, they're not going to have a point of contact, or maybe they do, but they know the point of contact isn't dealing with them. So this is really one of those prohibitive pieces of data that will hopefully have them or result in that fraudster, right, just abandoning this whole request, because you're asking for more information than just what's on the W-9, which can be easy for fraudsters to obtain. And so those are the things that I do recommend at a minimum that you include on there, especially for new vendors, but for new and existing vendors that have to submit a W-9. And then something else that I recommend that you can include as well. So all of that I talked about was all on like page 1, and it's just, one page that they have to fill out of the W-9 as well. But I do have a page too for when vendors want to change their information. And that is modification, or it's called modification to existing vendor records. And so, if any of you have been around me or listened to any of my content or read any of my content, right, ever, I talk a lot about avoiding fraud with business email compromise, where vendors will submit a request to change, fraudsters will submit a fraudulent request to change vendor banking to divert the payments. Well, one way that you can get away with that is on the have your own vendor banking form and require the existing banking in order for them to change it to the new banking. And that's a deterrent for fraudsters as well. And I do the same thing with some of the vendor data on this substitute W-9 form on page 2. Again, modification to existing vendor records. So, for example, if they want to change your address, they have to give the existing address. And this is really kind of just like the vendor banking. If your vendor is a check payment method vendor and you are relying on the remittance address to get the payment to the vendor, in my mind, that is just like banking, right? Because they're trying to divert payments. And so fraudsters do try to send in, you don't hear about it as much. Actually, you're hearing about it more and more, but they'll send a request to change the remittance address so that the check can be diverted. Well, you ask them the same thing, right? What is the existing address? And maybe they have it, maybe they don't, but it's just another deterrent, another obstacle that might deter or be prohibitive for some of the fraudsters to abandon their request. So address is one, contact information is another. I'll be honest with you here, a lot of the clients that I recommend this for will decline to have it required. It's still on the form, it's just not required, but I put it there because the contact information, right, can be critical, because if you think about it, that's the person that contact is the one that you call for the confirmation of vendor changes. And so that email address, phone number, right, can be critical. And then I do the same thing for the vendor name and also the tax ID. And again, you don't have to make it required, but on my template version of the form, it is required. So that's what I include. And keep in mind too, if you are creating a new substitute W-9, then you have to also include all the instructions as well. And so if you have an existing substitute W-9 that you just need to update, make sure you update the instructions as well. All right, so the biggest thing is using a substitute W-9 versus the IRS's version of the W-9 is you get to collect more vendor data. Now, the second benefit, and maybe this could be the most important, is that it could be easier for your vendor to complete, because you're going to use wording that they understand. So how many times, especially those vendors in that first tax class, the sole proprietor, single member LLC, individual, they don't always know, right? They're not going to read the instructions, and they don't always know what to put or how to fill out that W-9 correctly. And so one big issue is they'll put the name that's coming, that the invoices are coming to you in on line 1, because that's what they think they need to do. However, per IRS instructions, they need to put their first and last name on line 1 and the name that the invoice is going to come in, that disregarding entity or DBA name on line 2. Well, the IRS doesn't really say DBA. They say disregarding entity. And so the vendor may not know what that means. And so on your form, though, you can put for legal name, you can spell it out, legal name. I have it where it says as shown on your income tax return. That's meant to say, give your first and last name. Now, you can make that a little more descriptive if you like, but I also include the DBA/disregarded entity name. So I include the business name/DBA, that verbiage, in addition to the disregarded entity name verbiage, if different from the legal name. And so that brings in that DBA that might trigger, someone that doesn't understand disregarded entity to understand that they mean the DBA name. And so that's one. So it could be, and that could be a big thing, right? That you can make it easier for your vendor to understand how to complete this form. Now, I said two, but technically, I guess I have three in that, and it depends. So if you currently have a vendor setup form, and you also collect the IRS W-9, how about combining the two? So now it's only one form. And that way you can not have to send your vendors two separate forms. Just send them one form to complete. And now they have complied, right, with the IRS's requirement. And I do have a tip on that in just a minute. So combining both your existing vendor setup form and the IRS W-9 form reduces the number of forms you have to collect from 2 to 1, at least in regards to collecting vendor data. And it can make it easier for the vendor to complete it while you are collecting more information. So all of that is just really good. Great reasons why you should use a substitute W-9 form. Now, I didn't mention it in my opening, and I should have, but I've got a great tip for using the substitute W-9 form. So if any of you that are listening, any listeners on that are part of my vendor process training pass, you have access to the template version of the substitute W-9 form. And I call it at the top of the form, I call it the substitute W-9 form. The thing that some of my vendor or clients run into is the vendor will already have a W-9 form. And so if you send them this long version of the substitute W-9 form, they're going to say, well, I don't need to fill out this long version. I can just give you my W-9. They're not looking at the fact that on the W-9, there's like 5 pieces of data, where on your substitute W-9 form, there's, more pieces of data. As a matter of fact, maybe they are looking at it, and that's why they don't want to fill it out. So what I suggest is you just change the name. Change the name to your vendor setup form, because vendors typically will not fret when they have to submit a vendor setup form, because they could be used to doing that. It's just that when you call it a substitute W-9 form, they want to take the easy way out because they may already have one. So instead of calling it a substitute W-9 form, call it a vendor setup form and go from there. And you will find that you'll have less opposition or pushback from completing that form, because vendors are maybe not with you if you didn't have a vendor setup form prior to that, but other buyers, right, they are filling out vendor setup forms, and so they are used to doing that, and that's one way that you could avoid that pushback. All right, so again, as we wait on the IRS W-9 or Form W-9 revision dated October 2023 to be released, this is an excellent opportunity to either create a substitute W-9 form or update your substitute W-9 form. And don't forget, you do need to wait until you get the updated or the October 2023 version of the instructions for the requesters of the W-9, so you can make sure you capture all of the requirements for a substitute W-9. That's where it's going to be listed for the revised version. And again, hopefully that won't be too long. It'll probably be the last week in October. All right, so that is it. I hope that provided you some value today on how to get more out of that W-9 to avoid fraud and collect more information, and possibly help your vendors create or complete the W-9 easily, more easily than they can the IRS's version. All right, so that is it for today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 260th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.